come to the third presentation on the quintessential dimensions of consciousness. Let's clarify for ourselves what is a dimension. And the clarification needs to have a caveat in it. We're used to thinking of the first dimension as the fourth, which is the kind of topsy-turvy that happens in physicality. If you look at the pupil of the eye, the image will be upside down. It is reconverted in the brain neurologically so that the image is right side up. Time is not the fourth dimension, but the first. And it works this way. For dimensionality to occur, it has to be able to occur. And the occurrence of the three dimensions of space cannot occur without time. And time's lead on this allows for the appearance of instantaneous three dimensions of space blossoming out of time, which is a motion, which is a movement, which in its original occurrence then is explosive, literally the Big Bang. But what comes out of the Big Bang is not a moment, but it is the occurrence of time in its initiality. The question then, quite clearly, is out of what did time emerge? And this is a cosmological question that leads to a number of classic explanations. The actuality of it in a very high Dharma yoga is that time does not emerge once, but continuously. So that it has an iterative emergence that seemingly has a beginning, but it has no end. And one can trace this back to the beginnings of civilization, because about 5,000 years ago, this was the cosmology in ancient Egypt, that each day Ra rises again, but will do so forever. And so eternity is understood as day by day emergence. And the Book of the Dead in Egypt, Pert Em Hru, is literally coming forth by day. That coming forth by day in Egyptian cosmology is that each day is its own iteration. And those days strung out become millions of years. And as time emerges day by day of Ra tapping back into Atum, A-T-U-M. Atum is a cognate word from which later came atom, or the atom. Atum has no paredness. What comes out of Atum is not only time, day by day, for millions of years, but that in order for the continuity of each of those days to accumulate to millions of years, there must be a Lord of the horizon of time. And the Lord of the horizon of time is like a shepherd for the iterations of time that occur then into eternity. So that one reads in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one of the most famous of the chapters begins, I am today, I am tomorrow, I am yesterday, with the emphasis in each case on the existentiality. Our understanding here is that time emerges out of nature, but that nature is a zero field. So that as soon as time emerges, it continues to emerge originally all the time, each iteration, so that energy has a sacral quality of mysteriousness continuously, which is why it is deserving of having a Lord of that horizon to care for it. Each vibrational iteration is a child of atom, of the zero field of nature, so that time itself has a sacral quality when it is looked at in its continuity, not only as energy that is now able to cinch into form, but as a dynamis which has no form but can be a process, given the fact that that field of nature is able to host developments of vectors which are not only time, but they are time for whatever occurs in its existentiality. And the existentiality is the blossoming of space out of time into place, into locality. One of the mysterious aspects is that if you have a rotational locality, it actually has a tendency to be non-local. That is to say, it tends to be radial in the sense of like an angular momentum. This is a part of the way in which we are able to calculate the true scalar of energy, that it not only has a space-time existentiality, but it has this proportional chirality, which allows for the electropolarizing energy to have a magnetic component. And so we have an electromagnetic field. That electromagnetic field is one of the existential qualities that time blossoming into space allows to continually reoccur. If one is careful about it, like at the turn of the 20th century, one is able to see that energy is always quantized. It is not continuous like a bar, but it is discrete, but occurs so many, many, many times per time unit that it seems to be statically there, seems to be a thing. So that existentials, like particles, are things we know now conclusively through almost 3 generations of experiment. That particality goes in and out of existentiality without losing a hitch. Literally, Every single thing goes in and out of existentiality. But so quickly, we don't lose a hitch. It is the zeros between the ones that allow for quanta to occur, not only in the first place, and not only at all, but that this is a quality that then lends a special kind of geometry to space-time, and that is that I have to quote here from Wallace Stevens' theory of poetry. He was speaking of artists like Paul Klee, and he said, "Great artists inhabit a universe so large that straight lines are seen to fall. They curve." Einstein was such an artist in theoria. And those curving lines in Einstein are called world lines. George Gamo's self-autobiography is called his world line. The relativity of the curvature of gravitational space-time is due largely to the quality of a dynamism that continues to emerge and follows the way in which space itself is framed. We know now that the frame of space can have the effect of being dragged. It's like the old-fashioned film in a projector where the shutter begins to waver because the frame is not exactly focused. Around intense gravitational focuses, the frame of space literally can be computed now to show that it drags. In what does it drag? It drags in the zero field of nature. And when we're looking at consciousness, we need to be able to slip into the spaces between the ones. And in doing so, we avail ourselves of the ability to understand a binary expressiveness like a computer that is able to take so many billions or trillions of zeros and ones and to be able to recreate the appearances of existentiality, not only on the screen, but literally in four-dimensional images. The classic investigation of consciousness some 2,500 years ago was already able to discern that this was the case, the actuality of it. And one of the most pristine of the investigators of this was the historical Buddha. To be able to discern that because the zeros are as constituent in reality as the ones, it is paradoxical for one to say that ones are real. They are as unreal as ones as zeros. But conversely, they are as real as zeros as ones. And it took about 600 years for another philosopher to come along to be able to express this with an exactness that at the time was astonishing. And I remember as a child being told that in the early 40s that there were only 6 people who understood Einstein. Einstein and his reflection in 5 mirrors. The philosopher 600 years later was named Nagarjuna. Naga, of course, is the, not only the snake, but it's the king of snakes. It's the king cobra. And in the Buddha's enlightenment, he not only sat under a Bodhi tree, he sat under 4 trees. And each one for 7 days, 7 nights. So it was a lunar cycle of those 4 trees. The last one was the Bodhi tree. But one of the trees that he sat under, there was a lightning storm. And the Naga king, King Cobra, came and wrapped himself proverbially 7 times around the body of the Buddha, not to strangle him. Cobras do not do that, but to put his hood over the Buddha so as not only to protect him from the rain, but to protect him from the lightning, because the Naga king could conduct the lightning back into the ground and save the Buddha from being electrocuted. So Nagarjuna is named for the Naga king and Arjuna from the Bhagavad Gita. And he was born in South India. And he lived for about 100 years. And the dates of his life are difficult to settle on, but you can be assured that we're not far off by saying it was 50 AD to 150 AD. And he not only was one of the greatest meditators of all time, but he was a master architect as well. He built 2 great centers of the early Mahayana, Amaravati and Nagarjuna Kanda, the hill of Nagarjuna. And both of those are on the Krishna River, one of the big rivers that goes from the Bay of Bengal into the interior of India and goes up into the higher part of the south around Hyderabad. Nagarjuna refined the historical Buddha because he had a prismatic forerunner whose name was Ashvaghosha. And Ashvaghosha, his name literally means the horse, the Ashva, the horse when it's neighing. The horse was always an animal that was of extraordinary power and utility. A man on a horse could cover 10 times what a fast man could cover on his own feet. Ashvaghosha prismatically was able to carry what St. Thomas had brought to India as a refinement by Jesus of the original yoga that ended with the completeness of the historical Buddha. That the historical Buddha said of himself that he was a Tathagata. His Tathata, his suchness, was gone. Not gone somewhere, not gone from here, but that it was able to access not only the zero field of nature in its primordiality before time even occurred, but was able to access another field which was an infinite field. And that infinite field is the field of consciousness. So that nature is a field and consciousness is a field, but they are not parallel. They are complementary. And that complementarity is what led Niels Bohr about 1913, 1914, about the time that the First World War was just beginning to break out, to focus on the new atom of Rutherford that showed that its particality could be accessed and split. And the splitting of the atom was due to the fact that before the nucleus was posited by Rutherford, the proton, the electron had been discovered about a generation before by J.J. Thomson, 1896. So when the proton was theorized, was visualized by Rutherford, and the electron put together as the atom, it became apparent that the atom was not a unity which could not be divided, but was rather like the solar system with the electrons orbiting the proton. It wasn't until about 20 years after that that the neutron was discovered in 1932, which made a huge difference because the neutron then brought in a 3-value scalar that instead of having just a plus and minus, there was also a neutral. And where there is a neutral, one now has a very interesting thing. If Bohr's complementarity was true about the way in which the space between the electron and the proton, the space itself had a field-like quality of being able to distribute the positive and negative charges, the negative electrons, the positive protons, their polarity was distributed inside the space of the atom in such a way that that space now contributed to the existentiality of the atom, and that one could literally ionize an atom by taking an electron away. If one did so, the entire atom now had different qualities. One of the qualities that made it distinct, later on became known as an isotope, is that somehow the spatiality inside an atom between the electrons and the nucleus, that space, however small it is to us, is immense and enormous in terms of the atom. The analogy is that if you took an atom's diameter as a football field, the nucleus would be a pea on the 50-yard line. And the electron would be the spark from a cigarette someplace in the stands. But that space has a distributive quality that changes the way in which existentials in their energy come into vibration. And last week we talked about the fact that we are able now in our analytic refinement to see that there are certain isotopes that can be viewed so that we can see that there are special isotope cases where a neutron will orbit the rest of the protons and neutrons, and that the space in between an orbiting neutron and the rest of the nucleus is about 7 femtometers. That's quadrillions, a billionth of a billionth of a billionth. And that can be measured. And when it's measured, the peculiar thing is that the neutron does not show as a neutron, it shows as a halo around the nucleus. So that literally there is a redistribution of the fundamental way in which energy becomes occurring in the universe, which distributes the energy as a supranatural light, like a halo. So that the images of a sacred person having a halo, having a nimbus, is actually physiologically true on the nuclear physics level. What is deeper for us is that consciousness was able, even 2,500 years ago with the historical Buddha, and then 600 years later with Nagarjuna, to understand that there is a symmetry of 0 and 1, which allows for a parity that encourages then the pairedness of 0 and 1, so that whenever the ones occur, they always occur with the nascent, latent zeroness in their existentiality. And later on, this became apparent when one discovered, for instance, in nuclear physics, that electrons have holes. When they leave an orbit, there will be a hole from that electron having left, and electron holes are very useful in many kinds of manufacturing now. The same for a positron, which is an antimatter electron, and the same for a muon and its counterpart. And each of these particles has a neutrino, which is that ghost-like halo distributed energy penumbra. And consciousness has its particular qualities in complement to all of that. We're used to saying that is a phenomenon, but we fall into a very subtle, vicious habit, and it is a habit, to say that the complementarity to phenomena is a noumenon. And this is misleading. And it was misleading especially in the classic high dharma of the Mahayana Buddhism, because for a while there was a revision of Nagarjuna's great symmetry, the symmetry of shunyata, void, and tathata, suchness, the one and the zero. And the great revision of it was developed by a very powerful meditator named Asanga. He lived in the late 300s into the early 400s AD. His mother had two husbands, and Asanga was the child of the first husband, and he had two brothers who were her children by the second husband. And the middle brother, half-brother, Vasubandhu, became one of the great popularizers of his older brother, Asanga. And what they developed was called the Yogacara, the use of a Buddhist yoga to be able to understand the largest range of reality. And one of his great works is called the Bodhisattva Bhumi, and it is very difficult reading. And a woman named Janice Dean Willis, who was at Columbia University, decided to clear everything up as best she could, and she translated the kernel of the Bodhisattva Bhumi, the chapter known as the Artha, on knowing reality. It's all about consciousness, and it begins. What is knowledge of reality? Concisely, there are two sorts. The sort which consists of knowing the noumenal aspect of dharmas, or the true state of dharmas as they are in themselves, and two, that sort which consists of knowing the phenomenal aspect of dharmas as they are in totality. In short, knowledge of reality should be understood as knowledge of dharmas as they are and as they are in totality. Now, in that initial paragraph, one can understand the classic harmonic that is in my learning civilization program, which I call the yoga of civilization, but in a different sense from Asanga. It is so rare to be able to refine, to see the error in the Yogacara. It is almost like being able to see the halo distribution of energy of an orbiting neutron around the rest of the nucleus. It requires an extraordinary refinement to do this. And it was many centuries before someone came along who was able to refine that and see that. And it was the name of that great, he's called classically the Buddhist saint. His name was Shantideva. He lived in the 8th century in the 700s. And his classic work is called the Bodhicaryavatara, on guarding the thought of enlightenment. The thought of enlightenment is like, in terms of Asanga, a noumenal Big Bang. As soon as the thought of enlightenment occurs, it will take however long it takes, but that will blossom, that will grow, and enlightenment will be there. The difficulty is that if we consider noumenon and phenomenon as parallels, we will fall into Zeno's paradox and we will never get there. Because the space of parallels can be portioned, but each portion can be portioned and portioned and portioned. Zeno's paradox is the turtle and the hare in the race. The turtle never stops. The hare runs halfway. It's so far ahead it stops. Then it runs halfway. And then it runs halfway. And there is no end to the halfways that one can go. This is not only Zeno's paradox, but it is the classic stutter of delusion. Delusion is a stutter, and because it is a stutter, like a stuck frame, it has a pair of adjuncts that come up constantly with it, and one of the adjuncts is anger. It's a frustration. Another adjunct is lust, which is trying to overcome the frustration. And so one has in delusion, anger, and lust, the three, in Buddhism, the Sanskrit word is klesa. It means the impurities, that which impairs us. And that those three, anger, lust, and delusion, occur together in such a way that the salving of them, the solution to them, requires there to be a parenthesis that shows them to be parenthetical and not real. They are ultimately not real. And the parenthesis that was developed and perfected by Shantideva is to use the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections that surround the 3, delusion, anger, and lust, in such a way that they are opened up into the infinite field and into the zero field at the same time. The 3 perfections that open up into the nature zero field are giving, dana, patience, kshanti, and sila, which is a rectitude of actions, a moral order. The three that open up into the infinite field are dhyana, which is the concentration of meditation, virya, which is the strength and fortitude of continuing, and prajna, which is wisdom. So that when one opens up the mind so that it does not think like a Sangha thought. His school was called Yogacarya because it was consciousness only. Only consciousness occurs. Only consciousness is real. Only consciousness is a reality. And that reality is the phenomena and the noumena brought together in the real. And the error in this is that all of this takes place in the mind. In the holodeck mind, it is made up. It is perfectly consistent. It is logical. It is confirmable in a limited field, a limited way. But as Shantideva was able to show, this is an idealism. And it has been understood ever since then as being a curious genius idealism. It is like going crazy in the highest possible way. That you are beautifully mad. And that there is no way to convince you or to convince anyone who believes in you unless they are opened up to the zero field of nature and the infinite field of consciousness simultaneously. And when that occurs, the shape of the form cannot form fast enough to delude you, to frustrate you that there isn't more, to make lust attractive that you need to have more. And here's a couple of lines, then we'll take a break, out of one of the great Prajna Paramita documents. Where bodhisattvas stand. He does not stand in form, perception, or in feeling, in will or consciousness, in any skandha whatsoever. In Dharma's true nature alone, he is standing. Then that is his practice of wisdom, the highest perfection. Change and no change, suffering and ease, the self and not self, the lovely and repulsive, just one suchness in this emptiness they are. That was from the Accumulation of Precious Qualities, and the translator was Edward Kanzi. And it's interesting, and when we come back from the break, we'll see that though Kanzi was the greatest translator of these esoteric manuscripts, he didn't believe in them at all. His autobiography is The Memoirs of a Modern Gnostic. Let's take a break. Let's come back to not a focus, nor a frame, but to an ongoing harmonic. One of the convincing techniques is to fold into the vibration. And in folding into the vibration, it means not only going the way that the energy goes, but to concourse in the fields where the energy occurs. And this is called the high dharma. To look at forms is one thing. To consider the phenomenal aspect of things, their existence, whether they are things that are physical or they are things that are mental, they are still forms. They are still phenomena. They can indeed be investigated as phenomena. And they yield a cycle which completes itself, so that one can have a certainty that is like the measuring barbell called identity or identification, that leads us to the certainty that A equals A. 1 plus 1 equals 2. These are phenomenalities, and as we talked about in the first section today, one of the all-time great positings of the way in which that rationality and which that phenomenality is ascertainable was in the establishment of the Yogacara by Asanga about 1600 years ago, which he then expanded in an ingenious way to include, we need to be attentive here because this is not just speaking. This is a dialogue with space as part of the regard, which was a difficulty for Asanga 1600 years ago. And it took a long time for the critique of the Yogacara to be apparent that it was an idealism, one of the most refined in planetary history, absolutely staggeringly identifiable, and that was its flaw. Identity is always a referentiality between two phenomenal forms. The mind as a phenomenon, as a neurological brain, as a symbolic system, as an integral of logic and reasoning, and its referentiality to things, to existential things, to existential actions. And one of the comprehensive ways to characterize that is that symbols referencing to ritual, objectivity, can come to a completeness where the logic is certain with a difficulty. Primordiality cannot be put into a logical system. The origin of it is not accessible in terms of the system. One way to state it was a way that was classically stated in the 1920s by one of the greatest logicians of all time, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was an outlaw in terms of philosophers. He was born into one of the most elegant, wealthy families in Vienna. His family were famous. He was erudite. He was a bad boy. He refused to play the game. So when he went to the University of Cambridge, he went riding on a motorcycle and wore old, used military coats and boots. He was like a Marlon Brando figure in the early 1900s. And he particularly wanted to goad one of his professors, who was the world's greatest logician, Bertrand Russell, Lord Russell. One of the famous stories told of Wittgenstein is that he roared up on his cycle one of the early motorcycles, like a Lawrence of philosophy, around midnight, clamoring to get in to speak to Lord Russell because he had discovered a logical principle that was unheard of. And Russell signaled for his man to signal the other house people to throw him out physically. Literally throw him out. Don't just ask him to go. Wittgenstein's famous phrase is that whereupon we cannot speak, therefore must we remain silent. It's a translation of the German. That there is always a way to speak cognitively. And that cognitive speaking ties the symbols and the existentials together. We can talk about the actions, we can talk about the stuff, and we can do it in a logical way which becomes airtight in the sense that we can refine that logical system almost to a completeness, but what eludes it is the perfection of being able to understand where does it come from and where does it go. One of the classic ways to express that in the Gospel of St. John, he uses the simile of man's life is like a great hall. There's a banquet going on, and a bird flies in from the night, flies around for a while, and flies back out into the night. You don't know where it came from, you don't know where it went. Because the ends are not ends. They're not a part of the completeness. In fact, they dissolve the completeness into revealing that it was only an appearance. You were only watching a film, and now the tape is over. The screen is empty. Only in this case, it is the mind that comes up empty in such a way that you cannot apply the word completeness to it, and no longer can you apply the word phenomenon to it. And to make up a parallel by saying, well, the mind is now a noumenon, makes a parallel between phenomena and noumena, which is what Asanga did 1,600 years ago to make the Yogacara for a couple of hundred years one of the most refined religious philosophies that the world has ever seen. And it took a real super genius like Shantideva to be able to understand why it was not so. And he was able to access, as we talked this morning, the subtlety of Nagarjuna to be able to understand that there is a middle way. Nagarjuna used the Sanskrit word madhyamika. There is a middle way between shunyata and tathata, between the void and suchness, and that middle way was not formed either as a energy polarity by the zero and the one, nor was it not unformed by them. And so Nagarjuna, one of the most difficult aspects to understand is that suchness can fit into an idea, but shunyata cannot. The void is not the void. Void is not a the. And remarkably, one of the most beautiful contemporary explications of this was published by a Protestant publishing house, Abingdon Press. They sell religious books. They have for generations. And this was done in 1967 by Frederick J. Strang. And its emptiness, a study in religious meaning. How does a young Protestant man come to be able to understand one of the most abstruse, not ideas, because his book shows that he was able to step outside of ideation to appreciate and to be able to use in an analytic emptiness, not as a concept, but as a particular way of beholding, which has a harmonic resonance which expands itself into a kaleidoscopic infinity, yet capable of an analytic. How does this happen? It happens, if you stay in the mind, only by paradox, because the mind that has already made a concept out of emptiness becomes a mirror mind. And it reflects itself as if it were itself, as if it were there. The classic way of characterizing this 2,500 years ago by the historical Buddha is to point out that there is no one, there is nothing that is discernible when one is looking to find out who understands the Dharma. There is no one there. And to think that the Buddha then teaches that there is someone who's really sophisticated to understand that all dharmas are empty is itself a pernicious lie. Because the assumption all the time is woven back into, it's like a short circuit. And you can't tell because the light still goes on, but you don't understand that the light going on is a part of the short circuit. That there is a light bulb that goes on is a particular difficulty, and one has to apply a very high yoga to be able to unyoke that habit. It's pernicious. Consciousness will not play those games. The mind will. Symbols will. The body gets tugged into those actions, into those convictions, into that self-regard, and consequently gets spun up in those three impediments that we talked about classically this morning that are there in the Buddhist understanding of consciousness. That there is a delusion that occurs, and it is attended by an anger because it never can get it right, and a lust that overcompensates because it wants to get it right. And so one is always over-desiring, and one is always responding, and one is always in a loss of traction in delusion. Now, the classic West in psychology will say delusion is believing in illusion. And illusion is a part of the way in which the play of perception actually is creative. One of the classic ways to express this was by Aldous Huxley in The Perennial Philosophy. He said, the saint swims in the same water that the madman drowns in. It is the play, it is the Maya, but it is the play not in the mind, but it is the play of the universe coming into its iterative vibration constantly. And so it is the way in which an energy frequency then will cinch itself in a polarity that will make the forms and energize the process. But those forms in that process, in the natural cycle, the process is experience. In between the ritual comportment of things and actions and the symbolic structure of the mind is the flow of experience, the mythic horizon of feelings, of images, carried by language which rolls on the images and energizes itself by the feelings. And a classic way of explaining what this is in a three-part thing, it came in with Zarathustra about 4,000 years ago: thoughts, words, and deeds. And thoughts, words, and deeds indeed make a cycle that is complete, except for the fact that it does not co-opt nature. And the difficulty is it also does not take into actual consideration consciousness. We mentioned George Gamow this morning. One of his classic popular books on physics and astronomy. He was, when I met him in 1960, I was the head porter at Sequoia National Park, Giant Forest Lodge. And we would get thousands of guests in a season, summer season, and up drove this beautiful Porsche convertible sports car with a beautiful blonde in it and matched elkskin suitcases. It was George Gamow, one of the world's great mathematical physicists. And he was tooling around with his wife as if she were his girlfriend because he liked living that way. One of his closest buddies later in life was James Watson, James D. Watson, because he was the same kind of cut-up. They were like happy versions of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Gamow's book, famous popular book, was called 1, 2, 3, Infinity. And you can still find copies of it on the net for, I don't know, $1 or something like that. 1, 2, 3, Infinity. That if you count this way, there's an ellipsis between 3 and infinity. And he doesn't mention it, but before there is a 1, there's a 0. And 0 and infinity turn out to be complementarities. And because they are complementarities, consciousness and nature swing together. They really get along because they are the pair of fields that give a supersymmetry that allows for symmetry to occur in the first place. And without a symmetry, you have a very difficult time because there is no identity, even in appearance. Not only is there a chaos, but there's not even a chaos. There's not even a nothing, so there's no relief from that nightmare at all. And so it's a good thing there's a supersymmetry between 0 and infinity. And next week we'll talk about why it is that the difficulty in math by the 1940s was that the higher math on these cosmological levels, on these particle physics levels, constantly turn up infinities. And so there had to be some way to have a sieve to get rid of the infinities and get a good approximation of the exactness, and then you would renormalize the math so that it would be back to where you could deal with it in the phenomenal world. Except for one individual who understood, like Wittgenstein understood, that this is playing a shell game because he was also like Wittgenstein and like George Gamow. Richard Feynman was a character. He liked to carry his bongo drums with him when he was through teaching at Caltech, to go down to the student union and join in with his students of playing some jazz or playing games. Feynman used his genius to make a whole different way of looking at relationalities by using the field of consciousness in its infinity and its ability then to emerge prismatic forms which can be expressed, but they are not expressed in the usual math that is based upon identity, upon logic. They're called Feynman diagrams, and they just simply are scribbles that show expressively that something has happened in a realm which is infinite. And it doesn't detract whatsoever, because art forms are always this way. Art forms are not ritual forms. In fact, art and ritual are complete opposites from each other. No artist will follow the rituals. They'll wear clothes and drive vehicles that are offensive just to say, I'm not part of that. I'm not part of that world. Not only that, I am not part of the world that you project upon me. I'm not part of the me that you think I am. This is the most delicate thing in consciousness, is to understand that it is an infinite field that allows for any possibility not just to occur, but to transform all occurrences. And one of its qualities of transform is that instead of working by cognition, it works by recognition, recognition. And the recognition is there because the first getting used to it, getting one's feet wet without fearing that you're going to drown, is a retrospective quality. This was classically the first thing that Pythagorean communities taught. They taught that for 5 years, you're not to say anything. You're to learn to hear. They were called acousmatiki. You have to learn to hear. You have to learn to receive language as it is, because someone who is really teaching high dharma does not speak the world's language, speaks a poetic, not a rhetoric, not seeking to make sense, doesn't care that you can't understand what's being told, because what's being told is not going to fit into those rhetorical egg crates. This leads to a difficulty, because consciousness then is feared by those that are successful and comfortable, especially in the completed cycle of thought, word, and deed. And so someone who is able to teach that or to express that is sought, first of all, to be co-opted. They offer you anything that you could imagine that you might need. And that includes enough of it to be interesting. Or they threaten you with something that is so horrible you cringe to even think that, how could people be that way? And then, if that doesn't work, you are scared because you are shown convincingly that you are crazy. exactly what you thought is exactly what's nuts. Now, to overcome those, you can't overcome them, but they're dissolvable. They're like salts that can be dissolved. And the solution is to dissolve them in the field of zero nature or the field of infinite consciousness. And they dissolve there in such a way that they leave no trace whatsoever that they ever were. Because their traceability itself is an artifact of phenomenality. And the final cinching of that delusion is to call aspects of the mind noumenon. We have phenomenon, we have noumenon. Whereas the origin of the word is noumen, out of which we can get numinous, but there are no noumena. And this goes back to one of the prize philosophic characters. I almost called him a critter. His name was Parmenides. He looked like a William Blake engraving. He had long white hair. He had those flowing white robes. And Parmenides bugged everyone because he came up with the same kind of genius that Nagarjuna showed some 600 years later. He said, what is, what isn't, isn't. And they never meet. There is no way to condense them. There's no way to bring them into juxtaposition. They don't juxtapose. Zero is really zero, and one is really one. And it is only the energy frequency of the alternating of them that gives the phenomenon universe its phenomena. But just as that energy, that electromagnetic energy, is real in the cycle of phenomena, it is just as real in the ecology of consciousness where there are no phenomena whatsoever. And so the problem is not a problem. Aldous Huxley's psychiatrist for many years in Paris was Hubert Benoit. He wrote a couple of books, The Supreme Self. And he was a Zen master in a psychiatrist's office in Paris. And he said, the fundamental problem in psychiatry is to reveal to the patient that there is no problem in the first place. And once they are able to recognize there is in reality no problem in the first place, there is no first place. And that this is like this pulls the champagne plug and then everyone can toast and say, well, that's amazing, which it is. So that the devil builds his hell on bilking by deception that power is something, that lust is really bad but fun, and anger is too bad but really effective, and delusion is those other guys. And so it is a particular quality of ring around the roses. With this caveat, there is such a thing, and one of Sanga's great books is the Mahayana Sangraha, the realm of awakening. there is a moment that drops out of the time loop so that time does not record, and what records is that nothing records. There are three different ways in which that can happen. There is a timeless moment in ecstasy. There is a timeless moment in terror. There is a timeless moment in perfect equanimity. If you take those three kinds of timeless, non-moment hiatuses, they make a cone. And the zenith of that cone is a locus of no dimensions. That locus of no dimensions is exactly the way that Euclid begins his book on geometry 2,300 years ago in Alexandria, because he was an ace Pythagorean. He knew not only how to hear, because the next stage after acousmatiki is the mathematiki, who learn how to see. They learn how to see continuously, so they are not ever looking at in a perceptual way, or looking at, identifying in a conceptual way. They are always in a state of continuous beholding. And that state of continuous beholding is a visionary dimension of consciousness that adds a transform everywhere along the line. And so the very next thing that you get, not only does the field of visionary consciousness as a differential and the zero field of nature play together, but art is able to transform ritual. And history is able to transform myth, and science is able to transform symbols. So that symbols are transformable by the analytic of science, and one can come to a very sophisticated understanding that this is an infinite capacity to transform symbols. And that the initial transform is to show that the symbols are the completeness of the natural cycle from the zero field of nature. And when you analytically understand that, symbols are able to be transparent. And instead of being there as the sketch through which you conceive of what you're perceiving, which then boxes in experience to be such and so, one is free. Consciousness has as a characteristic the remembering of freedom. This is a very huge thing. It was the pinnacle of the Enlightenment period to recognize that freedom is not a right or a condition. It is the unconditioned before there are rights. It is our reality. Man is everywhere free, but is everywhere putting on chains, especially on other people. And to recognize and to remember that anyone that you meet is as really free as you are, because you are free together. This is a different basis of community. This dissolves all political forms that settle only for completeness, that settle only for a limited identification, that settle without taking the ecology of consciousness and all of its transforms not only seriously, but playfully. And when that happens, there is a great complementarity, and instead of there being 4 dimensions, there are 8. The 4 dimensions of the ecology of consciousness and the 4 dimensions of the integral of time-space But when they are in a complementarity, and we'll get to this next week, especially with the way that Niels Bohr worked it out, those 8 reveal that together they constitute a 9th dimension, which is a process that is a very refined process because it has perfection as well as completeness. And when perfection, the infinite perfection, is in complementarity to the zero nature, that 9th dimension is able to make a form. The best way to say it is Michio Kaku's hyperspace, a 10-dimensional hyperspace, which is not subject to the limitations of symmetry, nor is it encompassed by the freedoms of supersymmetry, but it has a peculiar quality. It is able to engender, as an 11th dimension, the zero field of nature. Now you get into string theory. Now you realize that the math that you were working with before was like a kindergarten game of playing with alphabet blocks, and you hadn't yet learned to use the language, much less transform the language into a poetic, much less distill the poetic into a mystic. And that every star system in the cosmos capable of interstellar travel, of intergalactic travel, is capable of also time travel. Where is death? Where is lust? Where is anger? Where is delusion? In that cosmos, which has always been ours, they do not occur. And so consciousness gives us a way of looking into the beginnings of a transform ecology that is now demonstrable in some of the most sophisticated parts of our planet, in the understanding of more and more men and women. Not only is there no need to kill each other or threaten each other or coerce each other, there never was a need to do so. More next week.